It's a privilege for me to be able to share some thoughts with you today. So, I have decided to have a title for my little talk, which is called What's Pain Have to Do with It? Journeys of Transformation and Healing. And so I appreciate your commitment in terms of the healing journey. You're using the metaphor of journey in your title. And that's really the nature of my own work, to understand our life process as a kind of an ongoing journey of sometimes trial and tribulation, but also healing and renewal and transcendence. So because my work is addressing also addictions, I teach an addictions class every year. And so I bring that sort of perspective of insight around psychology and spirituality to addiction. So I'm going to share some of my sort of primary assumptions and conclusions about how the healing journey can unfold within addictions. And so I want to start, though, in a kind of a broad way in terms of understanding our human condition. What is the human condition? So there seems to be kind of endless paths of potential addictive ways of trying to sort of prop up one's life using the rush into some maybe quicker relief or some other way to sort of soothe one part of oneself, but is not ultimately get soothed without some other kind of wholeness within ourselves. So we are born in vulnerability as human beings. And we're born with a need for love, nurture, and acceptance. But our world does not automatically serve up harmony, security, and well-being. So alongside of whatever goodness we might come to know, we also know fear, we know anxiety, we know dread, and the pain that accompanies our vulnerabilities. So if an escape hatch makes itself available, such as through addictions, it sort of makes sense why we might ultimately fall into that as kind of one of our attempts to maybe secure or soften or find a way out of a particular pain journey that we might be on. So one of the things I do in one of my addiction classes these are advanced to graduate students. So we start with an exercise, and I give 10 minutes to the class to see how many addictions we can actually identify as a class. And we never get to 10 minutes because within about a few minutes, we come up with a list of a maximum 40. And so it gives us an idea as to how widespread our addictive possibilities might be. Now, we have very broad sort of categories, which include things like substances and all the different drugs and alcohol and the various types of drugs that we can use, legal or illegal. But it also includes what we call process addictions. And because our world has so many available options to us to kind of soothe the self and find this kind of escape from our pain journeys, there is a whole host of possible ways you might actually try to sort of fix or resolve or mitigate some other pain journey that a person might be on. And so I do want to name some of the kind of the continuum by which people sort of seek to find this soothing that it has such inevitably limited capacity. So I'm just going to name a few of these so that we can have an understanding of kind of the broad journey of this, both from its original sort of initial forms, but also its broader, seriously implicated, life-threatening possibilities. For many people, their journeys into addiction starts with experimentation. Persons can be introduced to a substance or to a process, and it inevitably revealed itself with some sort of positive elements. In other words, we generally don't pick things other than having some semblance of some comfort or some satisfaction that we're going to get out of it. So persons are not like stupid, they're looking for something that might give them some particular out for some particular pressure that they're feeling. So most people begin with an experimentation path. can often be followed by a kind of a social or recreational reinforcement where whatever sort of comforts you might have found, they get reinforced. And so we can more easily fall into something that has a kind of a habit type modality where we're using it for whatever reinforcement that we're getting from it. And so that takes us to what we call a kind of an early level abuse. And often early level abuse includes sometimes even a degree of self-harm where you can tell that it's hurting a person, but there's enough sort of payoff that can accelerate kind of the ongoing use. And then the next step we can fall into is called an active dependence. And so the definition of dependence includes abuse plus compulsion. And so that's an important feature here because when we get to that level of use, there's a kind of a drivenness to it and a higher degree of entrapment. Within this category, there's also a high degree of relapse potential. If you're already in the throes of that type of entanglement, the struggle out of it can often include the back and forth struggle of relapse and renewal and so forth. And then, of course, we end up with what we call a physiological dependence, where our very bodies are involved in the kind of the process itself. And then finally, what we call persistent addiction. So this is kind of the broad sweep of the continuum of use. So there is a degree of severity that we can fall into. So sometimes even these early experimental type forms of addiction can have a very accelerated dynamism to them in terms of our personal entrapment. So let me name some fundamental assumptions, though, as we move into this topic of psychospiritual wholeness and renewal. So our selfhood, our personhood, is a conglomerate of mind, body, and spirit. We are relational beings, and so our lives operate within the context of relationships. And so it includes all of our families of origin stories, our attachment histories, but all of that journeying includes probably some degree of pain and wounding, I'll call it maybe a non-validation of our lives. So every life can enter into pain journeys for which we don't necessarily get a reparative healing event or outcome. So our pain journeys, I would propose, are inherently relational. In addition, our pain journeys are contextual. In other words, our pain journeys include what goes on inside of us, as well as what's going on outside of us. So there's both an internal dimension to our pain journeys, but also an exterior side of it. So our addictions as well are relational in the sense that they draw in and include our contexts. So our addictions are not separate from our interior lives, but also our environments in terms of they're often a kind of a reinforcement to our attempts to find some soothing from our pain realities. So I would propose that addictions are largely motivated by the problem of pain, not so much pleasure. All right, I think that's a really important point I want to make. And so one of the byproducts, one of the features of an addiction journey is it challenges what we call the will or intentionality. In other words, we lose a sense of agency. And to speak to this loss, I want to give you a kind of an understanding around the nature of our consciousness. In other words, our consciousness is a kind of a dual constructed reality. And I'll share a little story with you to kind of flesh that out. So there is a well-known philosopher called Plato. In one of his books called The Republic, he tells the story of a person called Leonidas. And Leonidas is walking down the path one day, and he comes across a setting of an incident of a kind of a crucifixion. And he sees this grotesqueness of it, and he is so horrified by it, but he can't stop himself from moving toward this awesome sight and be attracted and repulsed by it simultaneously. And so Plato uses this story as an example of a kind of a divided consciousness within human experience. I could echo that conclusion also from scripture, from the book of St. Paul, from Romans, where he says, "The good that I wish I do not do, but I practice the evil that I do not wish." So these notions reveal to us this kind of a split state within ourselves. So we can fall into this splitness, into kind of a division within ourselves. So the spiritual operational word I would use for addictions is soul sickness. So we can fall into, I'll call it a spiritual entrapment or bondage, a kind of a soul in distress. Because, however, we are unified centers of being. So in other words, something sort of painful, destructive happens for us, all of us can be impacted by it. In other words, our mind, our body, and our spirit is affected. In other words, whenever we fall into an addictive journey, it tends to swallow up all parts of ourselves, maybe in not the same measure, but our minds certainly are impacted, our bodies then suffer, and our spirits become alienated. And so we can sometimes easily confuse causes with symptoms. And then we can end up over-interpreting our addictions largely through pleasure seeking, and we may miss the soul-crushing effects of an addiction. So I want to linger here a little bit and talk about this notion of the soul. What then is the soul? Now, most of the time, people use the word as a noun, but I want to challenge that understanding as a noun because it identifies, it implies a kind of a non-static, a static thing. And I want to really affirm the dynamism of a soul understood as a verb. I want to look to the words of Jesus with regard to the soul. He says, "What does it profit a man or a woman to gain the whole world but lose their own soul?" So this notion of soul suggests that we are on a journey, either toward or away from the center. Let me repeat this. This is really, I think, an important point. The soul is the journey toward or away from the center. So what is this thing at the center? Well, I would propose that it is the divine spark in us, the divine spark in you and I. Addictions, however, take us away from this center. And one of the sort of tragic byproducts of an addictive pattern is it takes us away from the center in ourselves, and particularly our compassion for ourselves, and probably also from the world around us. So we become isolated and insular within ourselves. So part of understanding the kind of the vulnerability of our human formation, we need to think about that kind of a core part of personhood, namely our attachment histories. So attachment, I would say, is the glue that binds us together in healthy or potentially in unhealthy ways. So with healthy attachment, we gain the ability to self-regulate ourselves. It helps us to manage our inevitable feelings and emotions and gives us capacity for choice making within our choices. So our healthy attachments contribute to capacities for things like self-soothing, self-regulation. Healthy attachment also counteracts our personal loneliness, perhaps, or social isolation, and it allows us to come home to ourselves. So coming home to ourselves is a powerful phrase, and it's captured also in the scripture on the story of the prodigal son. So you probably know he was leaving his home just for kind of his own desire to explore the world, and fell into kind of context of personal disintegration. And the line in scripture talks about his renewal. His awakening came in the form of he needed to come home to himself. And so often our addiction journeys are journeys away from ourselves and away from our home within our internal house kind of thing. So finding our way back into a healthier attachment to ourselves, to our environment, and to our relational orbit is central to a renewal journey within addictions. Now, there's a psychospiritual perspective that I want to highlight here for a while, having to do with what's called the self-medication hypothesis. And so one of the sort of unhelpful features of addictions is it's an attempt to find a kind of a soothing for yourself within self-medication, both with a process or a substance. So I want to reference that in a more thorough way here. So addictive substances or processes are in part an attempt to sort of self-treat oneself through specific comforts, which temporarily often relieves an intolerable emotional state. So these are kind of the emotional escape valves that we find ourselves in, and we can become very stuck within them, kind of a process or an item that temporarily soothes. Now, within addictions, by their very nature, they activate a kind of a deficit and contribute to a deficit in our self-care, because it sort of blocks us from finding healthier outlets for the journeys that we're on. And so addictions sort of promotes themselves as a kind of a temporary soothing, but it does not actually satisfy, right? It takes us into these sort of unconnected parts of ourselves, especially where our wounds reside. And so the destructive part of addictions is it sort of extends this perpetual attempt to sort of find this escapist outcome without any kind of resolution or any healing offered to ourselves. In addition, an addiction journey often creates a very intense self-criticism. And so there's a kind of a inevitable guilt and shame byproduct to addictions, where the negation of self contributes or adds to the kind of the disintegration effect. To those of you that have found sort of positive support and resonance through AA paradigms and AA models, you'll know that a couple of the steps include naming guilt as part of the inevitable disintegration effect, and the renewal that comes from AA structures help us address that. And so I want to identify these factors as particularly the guilt part, but I want to underscore also the element of shame. So one of the tragic byproducts of an addictive process is there is a kind of a destructive effect in the relationships that you undergo. And we can hurt people that we care and love about. We abandon people, we get angry, we get volatile. And so there's generally a lot of guilt that comes with a healing journey. In other words, as you become more aware and awake to the dilemma, of necessity, we need to sort of own the contributions that we've brought to relationships that have been wounded and violated and so forth. So certainly addressing the guilt part is an important awareness and an important commitment to make for renewal and forgiveness and whatever is still needed to do with that. But the other layer is often ignored or is unavailable to us. And then the layer here I'm talking about is shame. So shame is a dynamic that has to do with our relationship to ourselves. In other words, guilt is more focused on violations toward others, but shame has more to do with your relationship to yourself. And that's often the part that's really, really hard to unpack. And the shame uncovering theme is really an important part of a fuller healing and renewal journey, because there's often a kind of a deep self-negation and self-loathing that can settle into your own soul. And without naming that shame part, we can find ourselves being sort of really almost permanently blocked from that part of renewal. And so when we're not addressing the shame part, we can really inadvertently end up with even more addictive possibilities, because we're looking for other escapes. You know, if a particular addictive pattern we've sort of leaned on, we can sort of allow other addictions to sort of sneak in under the radar kind of thing. And so the unacknowledgement of shame residue can really kind of extend the addictive journey even longer than it perhaps needed to be. Other features to the potential self-medication has to do with our relationships. Often an addictive process or substance ends up serving as a substitute, a false substitute, to whatever interpersonal gaps or wounds or alienations, isolation that we may be living. So a substance can serve the need for a while because it's readily available and it has this other feature to it, either a high or some other temporary timeout. But its great tragedy is it sort of empties out the self. In other words, it accentuates this deficit to self-care. So one of the byproducts of addiction is this limitation to addressing your own necessary self-care. Again, addictions provide comfort, temporary support and comfort, but it's a false narrative, and it's a kind of a false version of the so-called comfort that you're thinking you're going to get, kind of thing. Now, thus far in my dialogue, I've talked largely about addictions as a personal thing within the individual. Now, of course, I did acknowledge that there's a strong interpersonal side of it. You know, we're forged and formed within personhood, within relational orbits. But in addition to that, there is also, I would say, a social dimension to our addictions. So certainly the relational fabric of our lives includes this interpersonal side of it, but it also includes us as social creatures. So often our social and cultural alienations can contribute to our addictive realities. So addiction is not simply a personal problem. So I would like to invite us to think about this broader social awareness that is often neglected by societies and communities and individuals as well. So I would suggest that there are themes such as social distress, social alienation, and social non-belonging contributes to our personal marginalization within addictions. And here's some of the social sins that I'd like to name here as contributing to addictions within our particular life patterns. So including things like the experiences of racism, sexism, ethnocentrism, perhaps discrimination and marginalization, experiences of harassment or violence. All of these things can create what I'm calling a crossover effect or a doubling effect. In other words, these are all experiences of alienation for which we feel separation and disconnect from our wider world and the persons within our orbits, often for which we don't feel supported or understood. There are other elements that I think contribute to a broader social concern here, having to do with maybe extreme class distinctions within societies, including persons suffering with socioeconomic insecurity. And so there's a kind of an accelerated despair in certain communities for which addictions really contribute in terms of their addictive potential and disintegration. In particular, I want to highlight the place of stigma within our societies. There is a deep, extended suffering that comes with stigma. And one of the suffering dimensions of addictions is the stigma that's placed on individuals. And so stigma itself can be one of the terrible barriers to the potential for renewal. So that if a person has really absorbed a lot of kind of a stigma burdening, we need to have a real awareness of that pain, the pain part of that part of the journey as well. So suffering narratives can land more heavily, I would say, on marginalized persons, including things like the criminal justice system, where persons are not in any way sort of finding their ways easily or freely into healthier systems of renewal. In other words, there's a kind of an isolation that's imposed on persons from another layer, not just even beyond the addictive part of it. So there is a particular challenge here that's coming to, I think, to us as faith communities to not just build community, but also a healing refuge that takes the prophetic voice toward justice seriously. So justice to me is a very important part of a kind of a supplement to what we're understanding here in terms of the roots and the sources of addictions. And I would offer as an example of Jesus as a countercultural model of healing within solidarity, both not just as an individual level, but also as a broader cultural and social level as well. So I want to add a couple of other thoughts that I think would be helpful for us to think about. And there are particular resources that I want to access for you to pursue perhaps more fully. And I want to offer a really shining light in terms of the addiction care is the work of Richard Rohr. And in particular, the work I want to his work is very profound at multiple levels in terms of spirituality and spiritual development. But in particular, he has affirmed the 12 steps as one of the really deep and rich contributions to the renewal pathways. And so I'm referencing his work on breathing underwater as one of his contributions. And so I want to just highlight some of the themes in here. And he has a very deeply sensitive awareness of how deeply we can all fall into addictive patterns. And kind of we want to kind of understand the universality of this life phenomenon, because we all are potentially sort of subject to escapist attempts to soothe ourselves, to fix ourselves in these more similar, sort of limited ways. And so Richard Rohr talks about what he calls stinking thinking, which is a way of talking about kind of the repetitive patterns of life where we sort of narrow our understanding of life and understanding of ourselves. And we look to these very narrow, simplistic sources and not dealing deeper with the kind of the causes of our pain and our limitations. And so the 12 steps, I should say, are one of the really profoundly helpful resources. Now, over the years, as I've worked with persons within their addiction patterns, there's some folks that have a tough time with some parts of the 12 steps. And so I'm encouraging you to have a look at that resource. I think it really does a really good job of maybe reinterpreting some of the steps in a more, I would say, deeply embedded self-awareness kind of way. And so among the things that Richard Rohr talks about is this connection to our personal egos. So in terms of spirituality, we tend to kind of beat up on the ego a little bit as kind of an inflated sense of oneself and so forth. So resources like Roar talks about kind of the ego self relationship. So I identified the notion of the soul earlier, and the other word that's used from, let's say, if you're aware of Jungian psychology, there's a very helpful way of understanding our formation as human beings in terms of the ego self relationship. So we need strong egos or healthy egos to operate in the world. The world is a very complex, sometimes formidable world. So we have to be able to navigate that complexity. But we need a link to the kind of the core self. And we could use the word the soul, or in the Jungian term, the self with a capital S, as a way of understanding that connection to this deeper core. Carl Jung had a very powerful phrase to talk about that. He said, the center of ourselves is a relationship between the center and the circumference of the self. So in other words, the self is the overarching kind of the Christ archetype, where the Christ within is the kind of the paradigm of our ultimate wholeness. So there are deeply profound sacred pathways to this centering, for which our psychologies and our spiritualities are on the service of this coming home to ourselves in this full relational orbit within our sacred journeys. So I'm going to stop here and invite you to invite some questions or comments. I'd love to hear from you in terms of what's your own take on what I've just shared and what any other questions you might want to bring. So thank you so much for sharing with me.
Thanks so much, Bill. We really appreciate it. Given us a lot of food for thought here. So yes, everyone, we would love to hear your questions. You are welcome to ask them in the Q&A feature that is down at the bottom of your screen. If you just click on that, you can type in there. If you're having trouble finding that, you can also click on the chat feature, and that can you can pop your questions in there as well. But I'll start here with one that came through. It says, Bill, what are the conversational cues we might get from a person in recovery that could indicate whether that person is heading toward their center or away from it? For example, how does shame and guilt disguise itself in a conversation?
Sometimes there are signals that have to do with, let's say, self-loathing. Like when a person has a real difficulty in having compassion for themselves, they may not understand the distinction between shame and guilt very well. For instance, there may be some need to sort of unpack those themes a little bit more, but also operationalize them. And so what I mean by that is allow for opening up the story of to whom or where do they feel that their violations operate? Is it more toward other people? Like they feel like they've really brought harm to other people, and that may be an example of more of a guilt self-definition. Shame has to do with a negative relationship to yourself. In other words, you're beat yourself up. I'm such a schmuck. I'm such an idiot. So the reference is always within the self. So it's kind of, the one is more outside directed. Guilt is more outside directed. Shame is more inside directed. And then it has these features of either external blame, like if you're dealing with exteriors, you're talking about other people, they did this, they did that. So you're always sort of unloading on whatever they're doing. Shame is more this negative take on yourself, but it often includes a harshness, almost like a brutalness toward oneself, and the inability to self-comfort and self-soothe. Or that's the distinction.
Thanks, Bill. Appreciate that. We also have a couple questions. Just wondering about how you got involved in this work of addictions, psychotherapy, healing journey, all of that.
Well, this is kind of it's not an embarrassment, but a kind of a feature of our field. So I've been doing counseling and psychotherapy for 50 years, and so I came into this field in the mid 70s, and so uh, and so I went through all the education that comes with that. So I have two master's degrees and a PhD, including in psychotherapy. For all of that training, I never had one addictions class. All right. So, so that's a kind of a terrible indictment of our field, right? But the era in that time was addictions and therapy were considered to be separate things. And so there was a terrible, in that area, a terrible conclusion that if you wanted to get therapy, you had to get free of your addictions before you could actually be in the counseling process. In other words, it had this rigidity about it. In other words, the conclusion was, I can't work with you unless you're completely clean, right, or dry, using that nomenclature. So what a terrible reductionistic and kind of a crazy conclusion, right? So anyway, updated now 20 years. So that language really changed. And so when I came to Loyola, I was asked to a retired professor was leaving. They asked, would you be willing to teach addictions? Well, I did not know enough about addictions to say yes to that. But lo and behold, there was a conference at Rush University on the main players in the field. This is around the year 2000. And so I had a really deep dive into the the theories and what the practices are of the time. And so I did some serious homework and have been working at it ever since. Because it's so comprehensive and encompassing, it's a very dynamic field because there's always new things we have to really address. I mean, we have other language now that we're inviting us to think about deeply. Let's say trauma. We never really had trauma as a whole nother layer of understanding. So there are these other deep awarenesses that I think we're gaining about this whole field and how it is best served within the broad sweep of the whole varieties. There's so many varieties of human erosion, right? So we have to have a much broader footprint of how people come to disintegration, but also to health.
Yeah. Thank you. I felt so much integration both in your response and in your whole presentation. That's encouraging in a lot of what we're about at ISP. Um, Another question, can recognition of our center or kind of that divine spark you talked about, can that come without faith? And kind of another question had come in about recovery processes moving away from a spiritual dimension. So what are your thoughts on kind of what you've talked about, if someone's not part of a faith tradition, and or do you think, um, what do you think about recovery moving away from kind of that spiritual element?
Yeah. Well, the definition I think of spirit has to do with a kind of a core part of ourselves in terms of our life force. So I think we can find very generic, non-sectarian ways of talking about that life force. And the life force includes your primary vitality, like the fire in your belly, the fuel, the desire, the life of desire, where your life is open and is seeking. There's kind of an open horizon, the questing. And so we all seek to follow the truest aspects of ourselves. And I think we all aspire to truth. We aspire to wholeness. We aspire to integrative, cohesive, non-alienated states. And so if we just follow the thread of your own deepest heart, of your own deepest desire, you are then on a spiritual path. By definition, you're actually on a unitive path. We can said away with, we ignore the word spiritual, but a unitive path. And one of the other ways to mark that unitive path is the journey of love. We are all formed in love and formed toward love. So the love quest is the flame and the fire. And you can put other labels on that. We don't necessarily need sacred labels, but that quest is universal, and it's the human that's the human fire in our hearts, right? It's a kind of the essence of our being is to seek that love essence in ourselves and others.
Sure. Thank you for that. Um, Another question is just this thought about addiction as being something that blocks our self-care and ability to kind of touch and care for those deeper parts of us. What would you say are some healthy self-care options that people might find as they're trying to reconnect with that part of themselves?
A certainly by its very nature, a chronic addiction pattern erodes the self in a more comprehensive way. So mind, body, and spirit would probably all be impacted. But I would start as a starting point is starting with the body. When you've been in the throes of an extended addiction pattern of any type, your body has been really gone through the ringers. And so, I mean, the obvious one is kind of a detox. If you've been subject to a chronic addiction or alcohol addiction, you can't get better without having a detox, right? So it has to sort of get purged out of your system physically, physiologically. So I think the body would be the first place to start. Now, there are other addictions, and like process addictions would have a different kind of a pathway. Now there are, let's say food addictions. You can't live without food. So abstinence is not the path, right? So it requires a kind of an accompaniment. I think a lot of these addictive patterns require a kind of a cohesive community of support. And there are these communities of support, largely through faith, spiritual environments, faith communities. I mean, AA is probably the classic one. But to my knowledge, most all faith communities have an awareness of an accompaniment that uses their own maybe precepts of their own faith formation. So let's say if you're a Buddhist, there are Buddhist ways of engaging the spiritual disciplines within that community. So every faith paradigm does have practices that would support your own habits and spiritual practices. So having practices, by practices, I mean structured ways of holding the tension. In other words, a recovery process is an arduous process where it needs to be held. So it should be held communally and held relationally. So over the years, when I've worked with people that wanting to work with me with addictions, I've had a rule that I'd be happy to work with you, but you will need to be in a community to support your work. In other words, I cannot be sufficiently available to you, even as a weekly therapy, to support you sufficiently enough that you need a communal base for a fuller recovery. So it prevents us from sort of being serving as lone rangers or pretending to do too much, or I'm the magic man for you. So these are all inflated ways of sort of fantasy ways of thinking about addictions. And so part of the dilemma within addictions is often we end up sort of grandiose or exaggerated versions of how fast or how quick a renewal might happen. And so we sort of ignore the back and forth part of it. And that's one of the great struggles of addictions is we call it relapse. But and that is probably one of the greatest sources of discouragement, both for the sufferer, but also for the caregivers and the community, because we tend to not understand that tension because you've sort of emptied out so much of yourself. You're actually having to rebuild the whole self if you've been in a serious entrapment journey.
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Um, we have another question, just wondering more about what you mean by being addicted to a process versus like a substance or food or something tangible.
Well, it generally comes out of something that the society serves up. So it can include things like your relationship to money, uh, social media, for instance, is huge. I think it has a huge addictive capability. A number of years ago, when maybe 10 or more, when emails were coming into the modality regularly, I used a kind of a little experiment with my students. So I asked the question, a little informal research here. I said, how many minutes on any given day, how actively do you have to check your email? So I can't remember what the exact numbers were, but originally when I first asked it, it was maybe like, I don't know, 10 minutes. Over the couple of years, it was like every 2 minutes. So in other words, so you do a little research on yourself, kind of thing. So we're probably all subject to the I don't know if allure is the right word, but the stimuli that come from being embedded in the world that we live in. And so, I have to confess I'm a news junkie, okay? And so I have to work with that because I could easily lose myself in narratives around, it's all good stuff, right? But I can lose my center, right? So the world serves up so many possibilities. Like there's an endless supply of processes, things that we could use for stimuli. I mean, I had a couple of students, former students, talking to me about their struggle with tattooing. Okay, or I remember a client with a Jewish Orthodox woman coming for counseling. Unbeknownst to her, her husband, rabbi husband, had created debt for the family to I think the tune of $40,000 buying property in Israel using debt. So shopping. So any process addiction where you have a kind of a drivenness about that need as a counterpoint to an inner void, an inner vacuum, hunger, vulnerability, a kind of a satiation of something, and it indicates a kind of a gap in self-soothing. So it creates a replacement for self-soothing. So self-soothing is one of the other primary indicators for process addictions.
Gotcha. That's very helpful. And yeah, a lot to think about. At ISP, we often say recovery is for everyone, and that we all have, these different kinds of, I like that, different self-soothing methods. So that gives a lot to think about. Oh, we have so many questions coming in. I think we probably won't have time to get to all of them. But Bill, could you also say a bit more about the soul as a verb?
Yeah. Well, the fact that we're using the word notion, or the word journey as a primary sort of identifier. So the soul for me is the journey toward the center. And so I try and strengthen my awareness, my consciousness that I'm always potentially moving toward a center or away from a center. So my personal distractions very mild and innocent, but they can be a kind of distraction from what's a core requirement in terms of my own well-being, my centeredness, my commitment to the world that I want to bring to others, and so forth. So, and I don't want to offer a kind of a rigid attempt on that. Like there can be ways in which becoming very sort of intensive and sort of self-scrutiny, sort of hyper attentive, scrupulosity. So there are dangers in terms of aggressive, like picking away at yourself, and you always have to move forward. You're always sort of searching for the better version of yourself, kind of thing. But there's no rest in that either. So I think being able to settle into your own rhythm, but with a consciousness of growth in the right direction. So we're always ever changing creatures, right? We're never fixated. We're never static. So our personhood is always evolving. I'm not the same person today I was yesterday. It's like things have shifted a little bit. My horizon a little different, my responsibilities are a little different, the orbit is a little different, and so we're always moving. So let's make a commitment to enhance our capacity to move in the world with authenticity. So ask the question of yourself: what is authenticity for me now or today? And so this is not a rigid thing or like with scrupulosity or perfectionism. It's more a kind of a gentle nudge toward wholeness, a gentle nudge. So wholeness is the goal.
Absolutely. Thank you. We have another question. Where has the use of medicine to address alcoholism and drug addiction integrated into recovery and some of the processes you're talking about?
Well, there are formal um, medications that can tap down urges. So especially around alcoholism, or sometimes the courts will impose a kind of a driver restrictions on your car, things like that. So if you're in a chronic situation of relapse, you're probably eligible, you have to talk to your physician, but you'd be eligible for, I forget the name of the actual medicine right now. But so there are these ways of getting assisted or getting some sort of strengthening it sort of it makes you sick, right? So you're not going to want to drink. The problem is you still have to deal with the interior of the person. Like it's one thing to have the external barrier that blocks you from doing the thing you shouldn't be doing, but you still have to deal with the internal void, right? And so that requires a communal support and relational support. So back to my point about I made a big deal about relationships, addictions is relational, wholeness is relational. And so I don't think you can bring wholeness to your heart and to your soul and to your embodied self without relational contexts. So, and where we put it to the test kind of thing, right? So these are not like paper or in your head transformations. They have to be lived out in real time and in real people and with real effects.
Um, Absolutely. No, that makes a lot of sense. And once again, all about integration. Um, Another question that came through, you had talked about kind of the soul sickness and also the social dimensions to addiction that a lot of like racism, sexism, discrimination all kind of contribute. Um, Says it feels like the world is struggling with this soul sickness. What can we do?
Well, I think the antidote is community and communal commitments, relationality. So in other words, not being isolated. Isolation is the terrible erosion of your own personal equilibrium, but also any social transformation requires solidarity. I mean, we have the heroic figures like Gandhi and Martin Luther King, but they were not lone rangers, right? They were in solidarity, and so solidarity is really the only answer. So find kindred spirits that suffer in the way that you do. You have a vision for the suffering of the world, and you get fortified by that suffering, and there is this deep well of it's like it's the kind of the mutuality of the flame of renewal comes through the community. So that's, I think that's the only way to deal with the social side of the sin, you might say.
Absolutely. Um, One more question we have here. Um, says, I find connection with others to be very rewarding and meaningful. However, I sometimes wonder if I'm becoming addicted to the strong sense of connection and intimacy. If it does not lead to growing closer to God and the person I am created to be, um, is that part of addiction?
That's a great question. And so there's an item within addiction care and treatment called codependency. That term has some ambiguity to it, because there are people that have this deep caregiving capacity and vision for the world, the nurturers, but there can be this not darker, but more self-emptying. Like self-emptying can be very sacrificial, but it can also like be an inflated way of feeding yourself in unhealthy ways. And so giving. So let's say if a person is a nurturer and is giving, and becomes aware that they become emptied out, there may be some element of, I don't want to call it addictive, but maybe a lopsided attempt to be helpful and resourceful, and so it requires maybe some self-awareness in terms of the limitations of that. Because if you really lose yourself in that, you will you lose your own what I call this the altruistic paradox. So if you're giving, you ultimately end up resenting the people that you're intending to serve, because either they're not complying enough, or they're not getting it, they're not doing it fast enough, or you're worn out. And so giving without internal tanking up yourself, you ultimately bring harm to yourself and ultimately to the persons you care about.